society where you suppressed, denied, ignored creativity in your life, like if you were called to be creative, you were encouraged to be creative because the village needed the storytellers, the village needed the singers and the drummers and all of the creative things in order for not only the health of the individual but the health of the collective. This was another inseparable part of,
Of
human
functioning
health.
communities.
Yeah,
But
yeah.
you know what it makes me think though is like counterpoint. Back then, if there was more than one person in the village who wanted to be the singer, the storyteller, the soothsayer, maybe they awoke to that after chasing dinosaurs, whatever. Late one night, they awoke to it, and they were 30, but we were all dead at 32 anyway.
Yeah.
Self-actualization is not so important when you're going to die by 32. You're going to be a grandparent at like 25, and you're going to die at 32, right? So
Yeah,
our
what's really
universe
interesting
is
now is we get a second life now. That it's only in the last 100 years that we're now living twice as long as before. It's
right.
very recent that this is happening. And so now you have even more of an opportunity to kind of find closure on your first life and
Yeah.
have a whole nother life. It could be a career, it could be focused on family, it could be focused on travel, whatever. You now get a whole second life that 100 years ago people didn't have. I mean, the amount of privilege that we have to like live two full lives, it's astonishing.
Or 10 in some cases. Didn't Al Pacino
Yeah,
just have like his 85th child and he's like 900 years
exactly.
old? So,
Yeah.
but I mean, you're right, because it's basically the idea that for the majority of human history, we have had lives that lasted just long enough for us to respond to what happened to us.
Hmm.
Now we have lives that last long enough for us to respond to the first half and then renegotiate the whole second. And that's never happened before. So it's no wonder
Never.
we're all losing our goddamn minds, right?
Yeah.
Dr. Gabby is an expert on global wellness and psychedelics. She's a professor and now a best-selling author, guiding people towards wholeness using writing as medicine. Her work was rooted in a traumatic childhood that included growing up in a home with severe domestic violence. As she writes in her memoir, she was 3 years old the first time she saw her father hit her mother, 7 years old when he tried to kill her, the same year that he did in fact kill her cat, and 8 the year her parents divorced. Her mother never quite recovered, and Gabby spent a lifetime outrunning the trauma. Through her modeling career, failed relationships, and a whole lot of academic success, which did not really soothe what ailed her. She studied at Columbia and did a doctorate in transformative studies. She explored holistic medicine, indigenous healing, psychology, massage, energy medicine, yoga, addiction, and Ayurveda along the way. Much of this is detailed in her memoir, All This Healing is Killing Me. Eventually, she found psychedelic plant medicine, which she says not only reset her nervous system, but on many levels also changed her life. On today's podcast, we talk about the history of plant medicine, both traditional and psychedelic, the first war on drugs, way back in the Middle Ages, and what has been lost as we have cut traditional healing practices out of our lives. She explores the stoned ape theory. She recalls Steve Jobs' first LSD trip, and we talk about why so many people think they can out-achieve their traumas. We look at all the ways that we numb ourselves to survive, which works at first until it doesn't. Dr. Gabby's father's violence may have muted her and it may have shaped her, but it never did break her. After years of searching, she was able to hold her father and mother accountable for their choices, even after their deaths. But the best part is that she found herself able to forgive herself for the things she needed to. And even though, for a while there, all that healing really was killing her, nowadays, she feels like it's all just blue skies ahead. Welcome, Dr. Gabby. Thank you for joining me
Thanks for
from
having
sunny
me.
Florida on a dreary day in New York City. So I wish I was with you. And as we've established in our prior chat, one of us made better life choices because you have flamingos behind you. I have a dark black wall and caked on makeup. So, I'm winning. I'm winning. I know you studied at Columbia, did your doctorate in transformative studies, and then went down the rabbit hole. both for your personal healing and for the work you do with others, studying everything from plant medicine to indigenous healers to psychology. Like a lot of people with intense resumes, you had to endure a lot of twists and turns along the way. And there are things that brought you to it, all of which you detailed in your first book. All this healing is killing me, which I love. Love that title so much. And I know you've heard that a million times, but what a beautiful title. We will get to your origin story and we will get to the moment where you decide if you're going to become a hero or a villain. And obviously, you become the hero. But first of all,
Wait,
let's
do I
start
get? I
with
want to do the villain. Wait, can we go
you
down
want
this
to do the
villain
villain?
road? This sounds great. How do I sign up for that?
Maybe that's your next act. I mean, look, all heroes and villains have the same origin story, trauma in childhood, and they have to make a choice, and they save the world because they weren't saved. It's beautiful. It's what I talk to my son about it all the time. What are you going to do about it? Heroes and villains have the same origin story. Whatever he thinks his hero villain moment is, it could be like not being picked on the playground, right? But let's talk about you and not my son, because he thinks he's Batman, and I'm going to disavow him of the notion.
Again, I think these topics are way more interesting. Like, I want to be Batgirl. Like, this is...
Well, okay, so then that'll be good. Batgirl. And that's my alter ego. Batgirl and Sleepy Lady walk into a bar. Is that the beginning of the joke? Because
Yes.
I would be called Sleepy Lady. Look, I love a good TED Talk, and I did watch yours, which made me wonder so many things. First question, because I think you are a wealth of knowledge since you've been studying all these things because you care about them. What's the stoned ape theory?
The stoned ape theory is something that I referenced in my recent presentation at the South by Southwest Festival in Austin, Texas. I gave a talk about psychedelics and creativity, how we might be able to leverage some of the plant medicine to expand our thinking and our consciousness and our productivity and generate new ideas, because as we know, the world needs new ideas. We can't keep doing things the way that we're doing them. And the stoned ape theory is one version of human consciousness which says that millions of years ago, after the Big Bang and after the Earth came into formation and after monkeys started grazing across the Sahara, they found mushrooms and they started eating them. And over millions of years of eating these mushrooms, these psychedelic mushrooms gave them all of these visions and experiences and eventually developed into the human consciousness that we have today. And that's the stoned ape theory. And, what's interesting about psychedelics is that it's had so many iterations over the years. We have lineages going back thousands of years of indigenous healers using plant medicine in ceremony, and then we see all of like the herbalism and the women healers, and then in the Middle Ages we see the witch hunts and how women were persecuted and killed for practicing healing arts, and then we see a reemergence with the discovery of synthetic psychedelics, with LSD, with acid, with these other substances that then contributed to the birth of computers and the internet and the free love of the 1960s. And fast forward today, and now we're figuring out how do we use some of these medicines in a way that's ethical and safe and productive, so that we can improve physical and mental health, so that we can be more creative and visualize and vision solutions. We're facing challenges in all aspects of life, right? The humans and the planet and everything. And so how do we leverage the medicine so that we can create, better personal lives and collective lives? And so that's what I've been exploring for the last couple of years, very happily, taking a lot of psychedelics.
Which you're very open about. And it's good to be open if you're going to write a memoir, because you are very, very open. And I love that. I am a writer myself. I've written 4 books. I have never seen strength in silence, which is part of why I liked your book, but not liked, loved your book. Let's talk a little bit about the history. So for plant medicine generally, they talk about a third wave. First wave, second wave. This is currently the third wave. Historically, you say that healing, medicine, spirituality, and religion were synonymous across the majority of cultures on the planet. And the imbalance of those four was considered to be the root cause of illness. Can you explain that?
Yeah. That was what's so fun about my dissertation research. So I interviewed women healers in different parts of the world who were practicing Ayurvedic medicine, Chinese medicine, indigenous medicines, and I looked at themes across all of the medicines because I wanted to see like how did this compare or contrast to modern Western allopathic medicine. And the results were really startling. Intuitively, I kind of had a feeling it might show up that way, but when I saw it in black and white, I was really, mind blown. And what it was that our health and our well being are intricately woven into spirit, into nature, that there's a life force, there's an energy force. We see this in chi and prana and some of the language of different cultures. There's a sentience, there's an intelligence in this energy in nature, and that we can't separate. As much as we'd like to think that we are separate from spirit and separate from nature, realistically that's just not true. And when we embrace and integrate these ideas and these practices, really that's when we have holistic healing, holistic well-being, holistic health in all aspects of our life. And this is amplified when we look at plant medicine and way plant medicine and psychedelics impacts consciousness and the way that we become more eco-aware of the environment around us, the way our connectedness to nature increases. And I think it's something that we really need at this point in time. I think the pendulum had swung pretty far in the direction of technology and digital virtual reality and disconnection and isolation. And I think this is part of the pendulum coming back and us coming back into balance with the reality that like we're basically houseplants. We need light and we need water. And we need air. Like we're houseplants wearing makeup. Like that's all we are. And like we keep trying to like reimagine ourselves as some kind of avatar, and that's just not the reality. And so some of these medicines really help us to kind of understand that both ancient and modern approach to health and well-being.
You know, when I was reading your story, what struck me was it's very clear you spent most of your life running from trauma and trying to almost out success your trauma, right? And it reminded me of so many people I knew growing up who had a clenched approach rather than a thrilled approach to pursuing their success. And I knew it was coming from somewhere. Even as a young person, I could tell the difference and I didn't know where. But I always told myself, now, if they're not going into hard drugs and they're not getting into terrible relationships in front of me, then that's their journey, right? Reading your book makes it clear that like there is this beautiful irony in the way that you were going through your process. Because intellectually you knew you needed to heal. It was so clear you knew you needed to heal. But you are taking the trauma of a childhood where you witnessed so much domestic violence. You witnessed your father telling you he was going to kill your mother before they were divorced, him having a gun and firing it at her, and you being in the house trying to protect your brother. All of the things that would happen to you as a young child, especially the eldest child in a house where something like this was going on. And it made me think about the similarity of it all. You know, most stories of trauma really seem to boil down to existentially, why are we here? Everybody's going through some level of trauma in this lifetime. Nobody comes and leaves unscathed, right? The basic template is you're born, your parents have a set of things, you have a set of things happen to you, and then at some point over the next 50 years, you process or not, you grow or not, you heal or not, and then we all die. And it's not a new story, but the response of running from it is so, so common. And now it makes sense as a child because a child handles trauma by surviving. We are built to survive. You think about the kind of reptilian brain, right? It's almost like we were designed for survival and we're expecting ourselves to be able to over-intellectualize everything. And that's where the disconnect is. And that's why we're all in so much pain, right? So I'm reading your story and I'm thinking, what happens in a child's brain when they're exposed to repeated traumatic situations where there is no adult to help them self-regulate. And does what happens to that child's brain necessarily set them up for a situation where they are so numb that it will take some kind of medicine, plant or otherwise, to get them open enough to be able to process it? That's a really long question.
Yeah, there's a lot to unpack there. I mean, the simplest answer is trauma changes our brain. Like that's like the simplest answer. Trauma changes the nervous system, and the work of recovery from trauma is really nervous system work. It's restoring, regenerating the nervous system. Like you said, everyone has some level of trauma. It doesn't matter what it is because social conditioning in and of itself is pretty traumatic. Like, you know, as soon as we're old enough to kind of sit in a chair long enough, we're kind of put in a classroom and we're kind of, you know, conditioned to industrialized society, and we're told like some kind of sexuality is good and some is bad, and some behavior is good and some behavior is bad. And so like the social conditioning process in and of itself is pretty traumatic. And the thing that separates us from animals is that when animals experience a trauma, like if you see an animal has been chased but it escapes, it does a very physiological kind of like shaking and movement and stuff like that to shake the energy off so that it doesn't get stuck in the nervous system. And that's also something we haven't learned as we grow. We're told to stop emoting. We're told to stop feeling. Boys more so than girls, actually. There's some really beautiful research and documentaries around boys and how they're only allowed to feel anger and no other emotions, right? So there's like a confluence of factors here, like physiological factors, social factors, psychological factors. There's like a whole confluence of things that would take a very long time to explain and unpack. But like the simplest thing to kind of create value for anyone that's listening is like figure out a way to target healing in the nervous system if you experience any kind of trauma, whatever the trauma is, like any kind of like physical, mental, emotional, sexual abuse, anything from, you know, being shamed about, you know, maybe you had a learning disability in school, maybe you were bullied by kids at school, and then even, you know, up into, you know, like college and whatever different experiences. You need to target the nervous system in your healing, and you need to find modalities and things that target the nervous system. What's the nervous system? It's like the brain, it's the spinal cord, it's like the nervous system. And there's like an automatic part of it, which is kind of like connected to, you know, unconscious storage, stuff that's like stuck and stored. If you read my book, I wrote a book, All This Healing Is Killing Me. I have another one coming out this year. If you read my books, you'll see I've documented all of the things that I did along my journey to try to access the nervous system and heal the nervous system. And all of it was necessary for me to build resilience and build tools. I used everything like acupuncture and psychotherapy and EMDR and, you know, all the things. At the end of my journey, the two things that were most accelerated healing the most for me were writing and plant medicine, and the combination of the two. And for me, it was that I was incarcerated by shame. I was completely incarcerated by shame, and I was like alone in holding it, and I needed to tell it to other people. So I needed to verbalize it, I needed to write it all down, and it was only in the expression of it that I was able to kind of release my own cage, which is why I teach other people how to use writing as medicine, because for me it was medicinal. The expression was medicinal. And then the plant medicine. For me, plant medicine, it specifically targets the nervous system, and it's designed to create a purging effect as opposed to an antidepressant or an anti-anxiety medication. And I took all of those. I took all the Prozacs and all the Klonopins and all the Xanax. I took all of those. And those are not designed to purge and regenerate the nervous system. You know, they're designed to manage symptoms. So in the end, that's really where I landed in my journey, and that's why I offer support and resources around those tools. But there's going to be different things that work for different people. Like for some people it's martial arts, and for some people it's, you know, tantric sex. I mean, like it like you got to find your thing. You got to find your thing.
What's interesting is the theme you keep going to, though, is the body, the body, the body. Feeling your body to manage your feelings, right? And that's not the way everybody thinks about healing. I think it's correct, but it's an interesting way to look at it. The other thing is incarcerated in your shame. That's burned in my brain. Because if you read your story, it's clear that you did nothing wrong in any way, shape, or form, and you were just a cute little baby girl. And, it's a lot to read and to hear you say that after everything that you've been through. But what I kept hearing in your book was you were being muted and muted and muted. And then you learned to self mute. And you describe being a child, your mom going through this horrific abuse, domestic violence, and then her not being able to handle your emotions, which is not her fault. It's not like she wanted to hurt you. No mother ever does. But that does something to a child to be told your emotions are too much for the adults in your life. But it continues, and later in your life, you're in relationships where people are muting you. You have your father come and visit you at the hospital after a suicide attempt, and he's not able to let you just speak. And there's so many times where you're trying to get the words out. And I'm reading this book, and I'm hoping you get the words out. I'm reading this, and I'm hoping you scream and punch someone. Um, because I have a 4-year-old daughter. And, I am a girl. Part of why it's powerful is because I always talked about writing as comedy equals tragedy plus time, which is the Carol Burnett statement, right? And I've had my own traumas in my life, but mine weren't from childhood. So I was very able from an early age to say, well, what was my part in it? What was this? What was that? It was a different construct than being a child. And the thing about fiction for me has always been I write because it's my way of doing some emotional self indulgence, but also it's almost like if I could reach through the page towards the reader and grab them by their collar and shake them, what I would be saying is if you could only see. Because if you could see my story and you could see his story and you could see her story, we can all give each other more grace. So I don't think there's any power in secrets. But this muting that goes through your entire book, you have this powerful quote: secrets will do everything in their power to remain secrets. Philosophically, is a secret a survival mechanism that just metastasizes as far as you're concerned?
Yeah, you keep saying so many important things.
Well, I'll talk forever. That's the problem. I mean, it's this idea of secrets as a cancer that it
Yeah,
was like it
secrets
was
are,
chasing you in
yeah.
your book.
Yeah, secrets they were definitely cancer for me, and I see them as a cancer in others. Like I host these things called private writing retreats where people fly to Florida and we spend 2 days together, and they just tell me their story. Often it's the first time that they've ever told their story ever to anybody ever. And they either bring it in written format or they tell me and we record it and transcribe it in some way. And usually they cry the whole time, male and female, it doesn't matter. Usually they
Well, yeah,
cry the
I'm
whole
assuming
time.
both. Yeah, everybody's crying.
And they tell like the whole, and you literally, as they're telling you, they're telling you secrets, right? Like
Yeah.
they would have told this before if it wasn't, if it wasn't held in shame, right? They would have told someone at some point. So, but little by little, over the course of 24 hours that we spend together, you see layers coming off. Like they're aging backwards as they're talking to you. Like their skin is lighter, their eyes are sparkling, their hair changes. Like you see it. Like when I say body, and you had references, like you keep bringing it to the body, they
Yeah.
physically change as they're telling you, and you can just see it coming off them and coming off them. And then what I think is really satisfying in the transmission, right? So I'm the first person to receive that story, but if they're an aspiring writer, it's then going to go into publication and others are going to receive it as well. In the transmission, in the reception of that, I'm nourished. And you would
Mm.
think that if you were expressing something that was layered in pain and shame and things like that, you would think that in the reception of it, the person receiving it would be somehow diminished or, I thought, harmed or
Right?
repulsed, right? But
Mm.
in the reception of it, I am also like, thank you. Thank you, right? I am flooded with appreciation, with gratitude, with resonance, with respect, with
Mm.
like, wow, like seeing the courage, inspiration to keep doing my own creative like,
I feel
so
more respect the more I know about how hard it was for you to get here. Because if it was easy for you to get here, great, congrats, but that's not
yeah,
impressive, you know?
yeah,
So you
yeah.
like plant medicine, right? And I do want you to talk a little bit about the difference between what you call kitchen medicine and then psychedelics, because people say plant medicine. I candidly know nothing about this, right? I have friends who sometimes do ayahuasca and run off in the jungle and puke. I don't do that. I think they should do whatever they want. I think middle age is rough on everyone. I tend to reach for carbs. I do. I just like reach for the carbs. I reach for my cozy blankets, and that's it. And I call somebody I can complain to, right? But I don't, this idea of running out doesn't necessarily ever serve me. Part of that is I traveled alone for a year in my early 20s. So I have that experience of being out in the wilderness really intensely for an entire year, using a fake name, running around just being a crazy 22-year-old. So going away from the things I know doesn't help me, but I know it helps a lot of people. And what I keep thinking when they tell me about these experiences, and there are people who will say they'll never touch any alcohol. Meanwhile, they have to do their ayahuasca 4 times a year. And I'm like, whatever works for you, right? But it makes me think that what they are trying to do is access their vulnerability. And that's all they're trying to do, right? They in many cases, these are people who are perfectionists in different ways. And you talk about perfectionism really kind of being it was your drug, right? It was your drug of choice. We hurt ourselves to cover our traumas as children. Some people hurt themselves with illegal drugs. Some people hurt themselves with perfectionism, and that's what you did. Is it too simplistic to think that accessing vulnerability is the core benefit of psychedelics?
Yes, it's too simplistic.
Yes?
Yes, it's too
Okay.
simplistic.
I need the education. I need the education because I try to understand it, and I give everybody grace, and I want them to do whatever they need as long as they're safe.
I was in your shoes a few years
Yeah.
ago, my friend. I was you. I was like, I don't get it. Like, I'm a yogi. I can just breathe. Like, I don't need this. Like, I was you. I was you. I am the least likely advocate for drugs. I grew up in Dare to Say No to Drugs. Like, I grew up immersed in Western medicine. My dad was a psychiatrist and a neurologist, and it was like, these drugs are good, these drugs are bad. Like, I'm an unlikely advocate for plant medicine. It's like,
It's ironic, but growing up in New York, going to nightclubs as much as I did, I genuinely think of drugs, quote unquote, as something people use for fun, right?
mhm.
And so when this whole movement towards using it for healing pops up, it's something that I'm not searching for at this moment in my life, but I do think the world needs to understand. So you say that there was a first war on drugs for hundreds of years, cultures around the world, at a time when there was no migration. Back then, cultures all over the world believed in and used not only regular plant medicine, but also psychedelics. What was the impetus for the first war on drugs? And when did it happen?
Yeah, so many good questions. I mean, think about it like you're a cave lady and you have your cave husband. And
Lady.
you're back in the day and you made a fire in the cave, like, and you have your baby girl. You used to have a 4-year-old girl and she has a fever. Like, you're not going to urgent care. You're not calling the pediatrician. Like, how are you going to get the fever down? You're going to get the fever down because your grandma showed you that rubbing some kind of herbs on the baby's skin is going to make the fever go away. And that's what we did for millennia. For millennia. And those things do not have less validity just because we've invented synthetic medication. It doesn't change the validity of what we did for millennia, number one. Number two, now let's say like your daughter's coming of age and she needs to figure out what her life purpose is, and she starts having some dreams, some premonitions, some whatever. She's not going to go and enroll in college. There's no such thing as college. Like, what rituals and practices are going to help her discover who she is and what her contribution to the world is? It's usually some kind of psychedelic related ritual. It's usually sitting in a sweat lodge. It's taking peyote. It's rattling and drumming. It's going on a vision quest. And these are the ways we find a purpose that's bigger than ourselves. It's a higher purpose. It's a connected purpose to the collective. And that stuff doesn't go away just because we invented colleges. Like those things are still true. They still have validity, even though we've come up with other systems that are more industrialized and more modern. And so I sit at the kind of intersection of these two things. Like I've sat in the ceremonies and I have a PhD, and I find validity and value in both, and I use them in different ways. And that's why I say plant medicine is not just about vulnerability. It's about so much. It can be about intelligence. It can be about your lineage. It can be about your consciousness. It can be about healing. I mean, there's just so much more to it because it's part of a larger ecosystem of community, of family, of learning, of healing, of our history in humanity. You know, it's kind of a big deal.
Well, it's kind of a big deal. Look, I am all for Ayurveda. I'm Indian. And even though I grew up in America, it's not like we weren't aware that Ayurveda has been there for a billion years or whatever you want to call it, right? Indian people like to say it's been there for a billion years. And meanwhile, 90% of the kids I grew up with became doctors because we're Indian. So this idea that you try the Ayurveda and you're open to all the natural remedies before you put synthetic drugs in your body, I grew up with that idea. Of course, you would try the holistic medicine first. Everything up to, but not including psychedelics, right? That was considered a separate category. And so we're not really talking about whether or not traditional plant medicine for physical healing is worthwhile, at least on this podcast, because it just is. Ayurveda just makes sense, right? In all the traditional ways. We're talking about what it does for healing and what it does for trauma response and what it does for peace. You know, people over intellectualize everything. Why do you think they're so scared of psychedelics?
What happens if everyone's sovereign? What happens if there's 10 billion sovereign people on the planet? Like that is subversive. It undermines the systems that we have in place that create the power structures and the control. And like, is that like a conspiracy theory? I don't think so. There's quite a bit of evidence, like during the Nixon administration, that they specifically targeted certain groups with anti-drug, criminalization and all these things because they were trying to control. It was like a means of control. They did the same thing to indigenous people. The only remaining thing that indigenous people had in the US was their sacred ceremonies. And so they they took indigenous people and they tried to take away their language and they tried to take away their culture and put them on reservations and strip them of everything. And the one remaining thing that they had was the plant medicine. And so they criminalized that and the indigenous people had to fight to get that back. So I am very strong in my belief that this has been about power and control, and that you can't have all these people just being sovereign and self-sufficient. It doesn't fit a capitalistic society. It doesn't fit a patriarchal society. It just doesn't fit. So that's my stance on that. I can't speak specifically to India and when and how in India the
We're talking about
stigma
America.
happened.
Yeah,
But
yeah.
like,
There's less
yeah.
stigma. There's less stigma against anything holistic over there. But there's a stigma against losing control of yourself. And when you reference people taking over the indigenous tribes, throwing them off their land, we know what happened there and we know how much was taken from them. But do you believe that they were taking away these psychedelic medicines as a form of control, or because they
Oh yeah.
genuinely didn't understand it?
No, no, no.
Because at the
No.
time, this is prohibition time, right? This is when they wouldn't let you have alcohol. So the idea was not being in control of yourself is a dangerous thing, and you can't participate in an organized society. Isn't it
The
possible?
government made alcohol and gave alcohol to the indigenous people. There's photos of bottles of alcohol stamped with the government seal that they distributed to the indigenous people as they were taking away their medicine. There was
Did not know
intent
that.
to completely annihilate indigenous people. It was intentional, and there's significant evidence around it. And
Annihilating
the
them, I agree. Yeah, yeah.
yeah, and so the giving them alcohol was one of the means of destroying the indigenous cultures in the United States.
How do you feel about alcohol versus psychedelics?
That's that's I'm Italian, so you can't really take away my wine because that would make me very, very sad if you tried to take away my wine.
Yeah.
I like alcohol in moderation. It makes me happy. But I think that alcohol is highly addictive, cannabis is highly addictive, nicotine is highly addictive. Like a lot of these substances are highly addictive. And if it's highly addictive, it's highly destructive. And I've worked in addiction treatment centers. I've seen the destruction that comes with these substances. And so I think we need to be really careful how we use them. And I definitely think, they're not helpful to society. There are people that are very fundamentalist about alcohol and they say alcohol is a poison and you should never have it. That's just not me. Like, I like my pasta and my cheese and my chocolate and my wine. So I think you kind of have to figure out if it's right for you, for your well-being.
What do you think would be surprising to people about psychedelic plant medicine? Like, what have you learned? You've researched so much.
I mean, the thing that was so surprising to me was uh, how the mythology that I had been taught was so untrue. Like, we're taught so many things that we don't question. We're
Mm.
taught good and bad. We're taught right and wrong. We're taught who we can trust and who we can't trust. And puts boxes around people and places and things, right? Like brown people are a certain way and black people are a certain way and white people are a certain way.
Oh, we're
And
the worst. Yeah.
you know what I mean? Like everything is kind of compartmentalized with value statements, with judgments, whatever. And so, what was the most astonishing to me was that when I entered that arena and I did the research and I did the experimentation, it didn't match what I was taught, which has been true for
Mm.
me like repeatedly in my lifetime. I'm kind of like the girl that they say, don't go in there, don't go in there. And I'm like, I'm going to see what's in there. And
You're
then I
like,
go in.
knock, knock, knock. Hello.
I was surprised at the false myths, the false narrative that I had been taught about a lot of things. And I continue to unpack not just false narratives and beliefs about psychedelics, but about everything, everything. Like the more I get to know people of all different kinds of nationalities, the more I travel, like I've traveled to 50 countries, and every time I go to a country that has a narrative in the US of being dangerous or inhospitable or whatever, and then I go there and these people are amazing and their culture is amazing and they're
That's going
kind
to
and
be
they're,
everywhere, right?
it's
Once you
like,
travel enough, you figure out that there are no absolutes and there are wonderful people living in the middle of the worst gang territory you've ever seen in a country where it's the rape capital of the world and et cetera, et cetera. And guess what?
mhm.
It doesn't matter. You learn all that, I think. I think it takes 15 countries to learn that, right? Good people everywhere, terrible people everywhere.
And
Um,
it's the same with plants, and it's the same with drugs, and it's the same. Like some drugs are terrible, some are healing, like it's the same. I'm not gonna go out and tell anybody, oh, you should try meth, right? It's like it's like
that's not the prescription. That's not the prescription.
I'm not promoting heroin. I'm literally saying there are some plants that can help you. Like
Okay,
just to
so
be
a couple things that come to mind. First of all, you said if someone tells you not to do something, you're going to do it. So, Gabby, definitely do not share this with everyone you know and tell them that if they don't subscribe to the podcast, that they are doomed never to heal. Don't do that. Do not. Okay? That's one thing. And then the other thing is, you're talking about there's a piece that's healing and there's a piece that's self-actualization and growth and like using the tools that you have. But I'm more interested in the healing part. And I think people who are going to be listening to this will be more interested in the healing part, as much as I am a geek about writing. Because to me, that's just another form of therapy. It's a proxy for whatever kind of therapy people will need. When anyone talks about healing, they start with forgiveness. And people glorify forgiveness I think, to an almost dangerous extent. In your experience, as well as with the people that you treat and work with, do you think forgiveness is required in order to move on from a toxic childhood?
For me, the most important person I had to forgive was myself. which may sound counterintuitive because you're like, well, these people, they did terrible things. But really, it was when I told myself my story and I looked at the ways that I had continued to mute myself, like you mentioned earlier, and the ways that I continued to give my power away. And like when I looked at my own behavior, the most difficult part of the healing journey for me was self-forgiveness. It wasn't about other people. I'm like kind of easy to forgive others. I'm kind of like, yeah, no, it's okay. It's okay. But way harder on myself. And that's really where my personal work has had to be.
So, when I decided to launch this podcast, my idea was I want to ask super simple, really loaded questions to people you thought you knew, right? And so one day I went out and I did 3 man on the street 2-minute interviews because I just randomly on a Saturday, just to kind of see what would happen. The very first person I talked to was a woman, and I asked her, um, who have you hurt the worst? Who have you hurt the worst? She started crying and she said, myself. And she went straight into this whole story about how she had forced herself to try to be a perfectionist and all these types of things. And just a charming, interesting lady who I didn't know, who I randomly approached on the street to ask a weird question to, just to test if my idea about doing a podcast made any sense. When she said that, I felt a lot of empathy for her and grace for her. I wanted to give her a hug. I think I did give her a hug, but it made sense to me because she's an adult and she was talking about things that happened in her adult life. And the idea of you thinking you need to forgive yourself when the majority of your trauma emanates from childhood when you were a kid and you couldn't have done anything is something I really it gets me, you know. It just like gets me, I don't know, angry or something, although I'm happy for you and all the things. So much of this started with your father. And I know that you did your ceremony and you called to account all the people that had hurt you. Is there anything that you wish you knew about your father?
Well, I think you're talking about different things, at least in my context. Like there's different things, like there's holding people accountable and then there's forgiveness. And for me, they're different.
Mm,
So for things that happen when you had no control, you had no consent for things that, and that could happen at any age. You know, you could be
mhm,
sexually assaulted, you could be in a car accident, whatever. Like, when you have no consent, I believe that you need to hold the person accountable for the things that you did. And oftentimes,
mhm,
included in that process of holding someone accountable, you need to activate a forgiveness process because you're like, I'm holding you accountable for, assaulting me, and I'm, releasing my anger or my resentment about that, right? Like, that's a process that's like really powerful and really necessary. Um, I think we also need to do the same with ourselves, because there's also, if you've held resentment for years, for years about things that had happened, and I probably spent most of my 20s and 30s like in a state of constant resentment, then I had, there was no one that was doing that holding except for me. I was doing the holding. So there's like the act, and then there's like the holding of all the negative emotions. And
mhm.
nobody is making you do the holding. You're the only one that's doing that. So that's why I say there's a very subtle distinction for me between like accountability and
Well, that's a powerful
forgiveness.
distinction. That's a
Yeah.
really powerful distinction because nobody's making you do the holding. Makes a lot of sense.
Yeah.
And you do have to forgive yourself. For example, if you get into a terrible relationship and then you leave, you have to forgive yourself at some point for getting into the relationship, ignoring the red flags, all those types of things. So I get that, but nobody's making you do the holding is a powerful way to look at it because even when it's gone and the door is closed and you've moved to another city and you're in another situation, it's the holding on that's making us sick.
Yeah. And people think that in the letting go,
Mm,
they're either giving like permission or forgiveness and sometimes like they don't want to do that, and they think that in the holding, which is what I thought most of my 20s and 30s, that like I'm self-protecting and I'm holding accountable, that in holding resentment I'm holding accountability, which is also a misconception. And so one of, again, the powers for me of writing the story was that it was putting my story in a manuscript that allowed me to say, this is for the record. I am putting this on the record. This happened. I'm holding them accountable for this, and now I'm done. I'm done. I don't need to hold resentment. I don't need to hold anger. And literally the weight that was lifted in the putting it on the record and putting it on the bookshelf, it gave me a liberation and a freedom that I didn't even know was possible. I had no idea it was even possible. And I see that in other people that are also putting it on the record, because it's like putting it, in the archives. You're like, it happened. It's there. I'm done. There's a real closure that comes in that process.
There's a heaviness to holding ugly details.
Correct.
I had a boyfriend when I was 24 who passed away, and it was very traumatic, and processing it and surviving it and finding out all the things that one finds out in those situations. People were telling me to move on, and I had the rest of my life, and it was over, and at least it was a clean break, and we had no children, and that kind of thing. And I remember thinking, when someone dies and you know things about them that the rest of the world doesn't know, it's almost like you're left holding these details. You're holding bits of broken glass. If you drop them, where do they go?
Exactly.
Right? And
Yeah.
so the idea that you take these bits of pain and you put them on a book, you put them in a book, it's your way, and maybe it would be a speech for someone, maybe it would be a song for someone, but the idea that writing can be healing because you can take it, examine it, put it in exactly the right words, make clear that it was honored for all that it was and all that it did to you, and then into the world. I've never heard anybody describe it that way. It's a much more elegant way of describing the joy of writing. I guess that's why
Yeah.
you do what you do.
Yeah, yeah, and I agree. Song, painting, whatever. It's in the preservation. I think that we feel a lot of contentment. Really, it's been preserved, and we feel really kind of content. I just think that, to go back to an earlier question where we were talking about the integration of spirituality and nature and health and healing and creativity and all these things. Yes.
So, as a big fan of psychedelics, right, you make this point that the majority of them are non-addictive. Do you think everybody should be taking them? Do you think we should be pumping it into the water
No,
supply
no, definitely not.
over a
There's a lot
certain
of
age?
there's a lot of contraindications for psychedelics. The
Okay.
contraindication is like when something is not advised for you, and so like for example, if you have thyroid problems, you shouldn't do ketamine. If you're on lithium, you shouldn't take mushrooms. Like there's all kinds of reasons why you shouldn't do this, and you should be under medical supervision, and you should be in a safe and ethical setting. Like I'm an advocate for doing anything, and that goes not just for psychedelics, but it literally goes for foods that you might be allergic to, or
Right.
exercises that are not the right fit. Like
Right.
everything is not one size fits all. Everything is customized, and you know this from Ayurvedic medicine. You have a dosha, you have a constitution, and people who are vata should do different things than people that are pitta, right? Like other medicines besides Western medicine knew that people fell into different categories. They had strong yang energy or strong yin energy, or like they understood that you had to adapt what you were ingesting to your constitution, the seasons of the year, your physical and mental health. And I believe that the same is true now. It's just that we haven't had that approach. We've only had this very prescriptive approach, which actually doesn't work at all. So we're really needing to like rethink the approach and really have a customized approach to each person so that it is safe for them.
So my kids are growing up with various traditions because I'm Hindu and their father is Lutheran, and I'm exposing them to everything, but I'm very intellectual about it. And every time I explain things to my son that come from Indian culture and Hinduism, he seems fascinated. One of them I explained to him recently was regarding this ring that I have that I get so many compliments on, where this stone is big but not expensive at all, and I get these great compliments on it. And he said, "Why are you wearing that?" And I said, "Because it was a new ring." And I said, "Well, Indian people, when you get a stone, the idea is that it can affect everybody differently. Stones carry energy." And we don't really talk about it that way or think about it that way. But yeah, I would never wear a stone without sleeping with it under my pillow first. And he said, "What? That's the coolest thing in the world, right?" So this idea that we believe in things we can't name is not new. It's beautiful, but people still can't necessarily get over the hump of the idea that psychedelics can be um,
I'm going to
healing.
tell that to my clients. Put the mushroom under your pillow.
That's what
sleep sleep with the mushrooms under your pillow before you try them and see if it's the right mushroom for you. That's going to be
happens.
my
They
new
wake
thing
up
that
and the
I tell
mushrooms are
people.
gone. Then they got to break up with someone is what they got to do. Like, kind of messed up. What do you think? What do you think is kind of the story that we've been told about psychedelics that we need to stop telling ourselves?
um, I think we need to. All my work is centered around empowering people to listen to themselves. I think when people are called to these practices, I said at the end of my presentation at South by Southwest, how do you know if you should do this medicine? If you're sitting in this room right now, you should do the medicine. Nobody goes to a conference with 100,000 people, seeks out a room about psychedelics and creativity, comes in the room, stares at me, listens to me talk, who's not meant to have some connection to psychedelics. Like, if you're listening to this podcast right now, you're probably someone that needs to try plant medicine. Like, that's how I believe that it works. I believe that if you're having curiosities, if you're having feelings about it, if synchronicities are showing up, that it's something you should pursue. And I teach people to trust themselves, to listen to themselves, to ask themselves. Like, it doesn't mean you don't get outside advice and support and guidance. I have all of those things, but at the end of the day, I'm the one that is making the decision for myself. I get to decide, and that's really what I think people should be doing with this.
Well, you clearly trust yourself now.
Yeah.
I mean, I don't think you did along the way. Um, was there a story that you needed to stop telling yourself, or what was the story that you had to stop telling yourself so that you could heal?
I think I just had to tell the whole story. The healing was in the telling. It wasn't in anything else. The healing was in the telling. In the telling, and when I could see myself reflected back to myself, I'm like, oh, that girl knows what she's doing. like,
Mm.
like I like her. I like her, and like
I like her.
she's yeah. Like I liked myself so much more after I wrote it all down. I could see, instead of just hearing my own inner criticism, I could see my reflection as someone who was human, imperfectly human, and had beautiful strengths and had beautiful weaknesses. And it was just in the expression itself that I experienced the transformation.
I love that because what it shows is that it's in you. It reminds me of this book. Have you ever read Grand Central Winter?
No, is it good?
Such a
Okay,
beautiful
I'm gonna
story.
write
It
it
was a
down right
long,
now.
long time ago. You have to write it down. Um, I will never forget this man because I think he had been an accountant or something. He had been working
Uh-huh.
a white-collar job. He had a series of hits. I think he lost his wife. I think he lost his mom the same year. Middle-aged guy living his life, not causing anybody any harm, just kind of doing his thing. And then lost everything kind of that mattered within like a year or two. And I'm probably telling the story imperfectly, but the point goes, very quickly, he wound up homeless. And in Grand Central Station, underneath the tunnels, there's a huge population of people that have been living there for many, many years. There are huge encampments of homeless people underneath Grand Central Station in Manhattan because it was warm enough and those old tracks weren't being used. So he lives down there many years. He was living down there, and every day he would go up to the same subway stop and he would beg for change. There was one guy who kept giving him change and would at least say good morning, that kind of thing. He would take the money, whatever he got every day, and he would go buy crack or whatever it was whatever drug he was on. He would do the drugs, he would pass out underneath Grand Central, go back and do it the next day. One day he had no money, he had no drugs, He had no food, he had nothing to do, and he couldn't sleep. And it's late at night, he can't do any more begging. So he's lying in the garbage in the bowels of Grand Central Station, and he finds a piece of paper and a pencil, and he starts writing the stuff that had happened. And apparently grabbed as much paper as he could and just kept writing and writing. And then when he looked up, the story goes, realized that was the longest time he had ever gone not wanting drugs since he had lost everything and since he had become homeless. So fast forward a couple of weeks or whatever it was, and he has this manuscript of his story, and it's written on discarded pieces of paper from the trash that were all down there in the bowels of Grand Central Station. He has this stack, and it turns out that the man who he sees in the morning happens to work in a publishing house. And he says, "Don't give me any change this morning, man, but would you read this?" And that book became Grand Central Winter.
That's so good. See, you just explained it all.
Oh,
There it is.
so beautiful, but we're glad you didn't have to become homeless to get there. You know,
Right.
we know you were running off screaming in the beaches, and you were traveling the world and having the near-death experiences as one does in one's 20s. And we know that you were in the bad relationships and then the good ones. And we know that you tried and tried and tried to be perfect and, you know, all the things. But I am so glad that you found your way to what you needed, and you're helping so many people now.
I appreciate you. Thanks so much.
One last question.
Yeah, sure.
Let's say writing wasn't going to happen, and let's say psychology wasn't going to happen. What else would you be doing if you weren't doing this?
That's interesting. I mean, during the pandemic, I became a farmer. I lived on like a dozen farms,
Okay.
and I was out in the fields at the crack of dawn picking produce and picking fruit off trees, and that was pretty satisfying. Like, I could see a lifetime as a farmer, like owning a small homestead. I fed chickens and goats. I did beekeeping. I collected honey. Built a greenhouse with my hands. Like, I could see that as my life work.
There you go. Well, then, Farmer Gabby, you know, Sleepy Poonam has really enjoyed this conversation. I'm not always sleepy. Now I'm on the right supplements, you know, the perimenopausal supplements, the B12 and the iron and the 85 other things I have to take just to have my basic energy at this point. But perhaps you can prescribe me something stronger.
I would like that. I have some tips.
Thank you.